percent growth, increase tax growth, percent deficits, increase growth, percent growth, percent deficits, percent growth, increase tax percent increase
growth
were affected tax growth tax percent growth percent tax growth tax percent
percent
tax increase percent increase tax
percent growth percent
increase tax
percent
deficits
growth deficits
percent deficits percent deficits
increase
growth deficits percent growth